Hello, good morning. So in this video, we are going to discuss Descartes' ontological argument for the existence of God. So before I start, let me say a few things about what an ontological argument is. So the ontological argument, the word ontological derives from the Greek word ontos, which means being or existence. Now, so if you are giving, what this means is that if you are giving an ontological argument for the existence of something, it means that you're trying to show that once you understand what something is, then you will be able to prove that that thing exists. So if you apply it to God, what Descartes is trying to do is that he's trying to show us that if we understand what God is, then we will have to understand that God has to exist. In other words, God, if you understand the definition of God, then God has to exist by sheer definition. Now, this might strike you as being very puzzling and mysterious at the same time, because you might wonder, how can something exist by sheer definition? I mean, there are lots of things that exist in this world, but they don't exist by sheer definition. For example, I exist, but in order to find out whether I exist, you actually have to go into the world and find out if there is such a person who exists. Maybe look up my records or something. You just can't say that I am such a person, therefore I exist. So most things in the world do not and cannot exist by sheer definition. But Descartes wants us to believe that God can exist by sheer definition. So is that possible? Well, I'm not going to answer this question just yet. What I'm going to do is to get us to look at Descartes' ontological argument, look at it carefully and closely, and then maybe at the end we can decide for ourselves if Descartes is correct, if his ontological argument is correct. So with that said, let's get into the ontological argument itself. So in order to understand Descartes' argument, we have to take a small detour into mathematics. So Descartes is a mathematician, so he actually tries to carry out his ontological argument by means of an analogy with certain truths about mathematics. So here's an example from Descartes. He says that if you clearly and distinctly perceive certain mathematical concepts, if you clearly and distinctly understand certain mathematical concepts, then you will understand that certain mathematical concepts cannot be a certain way, cannot be the concepts that they are without being a certain way. So here's an example. So for example, if you clearly and distinctly understand what a triangle is, then you have to understand that a triangle has three angles that are equal to two right angles. Or in more modern terms, you would say that a triangle has three angles that add up to 180 degrees. It is impossible for a triangle to be a triangle without having three angles that add up to 180 degrees. If you say that something is a triangle, and you also say that it doesn't add up to 180 degrees, then either that thing is not a triangle, or you don't know what a triangle is. So coming back to what I was saying, what Descartes is saying is that you cannot clearly and distinctly understand or perceive a triangle without clearly and distinctly perceiving that a triangle has three angles equal to two right angles. So how does this apply to God? Well, Descartes wants to say that similarly, like the triangle, it is just as we cannot clearly and distinctly perceive a triangle without clearly and distinctly perceiving that it has a sum of 180 degrees, you also cannot clearly and distinctly perceive God. You cannot clearly and distinctly understand what God is without understanding that God is a being that necessarily exists. Let me repeat this. You cannot clearly and distinctly understand what God is without clearly and distinctly understanding that God is a being that has to exist. Now, why? I mean, why does God has to exist? Okay, good question. So here's his argument, his proof. So first you start by defining God. What is God? Well, Descartes starts by saying that God is a being that possesses all perfections. Um, sounds fair enough. I mean, most of us, whether or not you believe in God, when you think of God, you think of it is quite natural to think of God as a being that is most perfect, that possesses all the perfections. And then here's the interesting next step. Descartes says that existence is a perfection. So if you put one and two together, what do you get? You get, well, since existence is a perfection and God is a being that possesses all perfections, that means that God possesses the perfection of existence, which also means that God exists. And it's not, he doesn't just exist, he actually necessarily exists. He cannot be God without existing. He cannot be God without being existent. So and so this is Descartes' very simple and elegant argument for the existence of God. He says that if you understand what God is, then you have to understand that God has to exist. There's no way to even think about God properly. There's no way to even think coherently about God without understanding that God has to exist. Just as there's no way to think about a triangle coherently without understanding that a triangle has to have three angles that are equal to 180 degrees. So, conclusion, according to Descartes, is that if you understand clearly and distinctly what God is, then you will understand that God has to exist. Therefore, God exists. Very simple argument. Now, if you are listening carefully and thinking through this whole thing with me so far, one thing would probably strike you as puzzling and maybe even suspicious, and that is that. So remember that Descartes said that existence is a perfection, but why? I mean, how? How and why is existence a perfection? How can existence be a perfection? I mean, I exist, but I'm not perfect. And lots of things, all the things that exist in this world are not perfect. So how can existence be a perfection? Well, maybe one way to answer this question on behalf of Descartes might be to say that perhaps existence is not really a perfection, but it is a prerequisite for perfection. Just as I need to be enrolled in the university as a prerequisite for graduating from the university. So perhaps I need to first exist in order to even have a chance of at being perfect. So maybe the idea is that God has to first exist in order for him to be able to be perfect. That's an interesting way of trying to answer this question on behalf of Descartes. But ultimately, I think this answer is a bit unsatisfactory because because remember what Descartes wants to say, that existence is a perfection and not just a prerequisite for perfection. So how do we make sense of the claim that existence is a perfection? How can we actually explain how existence is a perfection and not just a prerequisite for perfection? Okay, here's in order to answer this further question, there's something else we need to look at. So Descartes lived in a very interesting period. He is known, he lived at the beginning of the Renaissance. He is known as the founder of modern philosophy to many people. However, because he lived at the beginning of the Renaissance, he also had an education that is very medieval in nature. A lot of the concepts that he's working with are actually concepts that are taken from medieval philosophy, from the medieval scholastic philosophy. So we can see that actually the view of perfection that he's working with is actually the medieval view of perfection. What is the medieval view of perfection? So according to the medieval philosophers, perfection is something that occurs in degrees. It's not, so perfection is not an all or nothing kind of thing. It's not that you are either perfect or you're not, but but perfection is something that comes in degrees. So one thing can be more perfect than another, and that other thing can in turn be more perfect than something else. So what does it mean to say that perfection occurs in degrees? Very briefly, we can the medievals would say that the more reality something possesses, the more perfect it is. So okay, think about this. So the more reality something has or possesses, the more perfect it is. So let me give you an example. So what that means is that for example, I am more perfect than Harry Potter. Why is that? Because I am a being that exists in the actual world, whereas Harry Potter is a being that exists only in fiction. I am also more perfect than Sherlock Holmes because same thing, because Sherlock Holmes is only a fictional being, whereas I am a being that exists in the actual world. So therefore, I am more perfect than than Sherlock Holmes or Harry Potter. Now, the medievals and Descartes wants to say that God is more perfect than us because God doesn't just exist in the actual world. He exists beyond the physical world, beyond the actual world. He is able to he exists beyond the actual world, and he exists in such a way as to be able to influence things in the physical actual world. Now, so therefore, according to Descartes, God is more perfect than us, and in a sense more real than us, because he is able to make things happen in the physical world or in the actual world without actually existing in the physical or the actual world. Now, this is and therefore long story short, if you agree with this, then you can see why Descartes would say that God is a being that is more perfect than us and which possesses all the perfections. Because being a physical being, I'm always limited. I can only be in one place at one time, whereas God, not being physical, is not bound by the physical. So he has one more perfection that I don't have, which is that he is unbounded by the physical world. He is well, you can say that he is eternal and also everywhere at the same time. Now, so that answers the question of what perfection means for Descartes, and why Descartes would say that God is has all the perfections and the existence is also a perfection. However, there is one interesting thing that comes out of all of this that we should think about. So think about this. God is not a physical being. He is a purely mental being, and yet he is more real than us. So if this is true, then that means that in Descartes' view, the mind or pure mind is actually more real than the physical. In other words, mind is more real than the body. You will see a lot of this same idea, this idea that mind is more real than the body. You will see this idea repeated as we go further in the semester and look at Descartes' writings in the meditations on the nature of knowledge. Again, you will see the idea that he arrives at the idea that I, who is ultimately a mind, is actually more real than my body. Therefore, what is most real about me is actually my mind and not my body. Now, and this of course gives rise to the mind-body duality, the separation between mind and body. And so actually this ontological argument of Descartes is interesting in its own right, and it's also interesting as a way of introducing ourselves to the bigger aspects of Descartes' philosophy. So yes, I hope you have fun. So I hope you have fun thinking about all of these things while watching this video, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you very much. Bye bye.